Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's film is an action fantasy from 2009 titled, The Vampire's Assistant. The film opens with the funeral of a young boy named Darren. Everyone is heartbroken over his passing, but to their surprise, he is actually alive and seen inside the coffin playing video games. The narrative then shifts to the past, where Darren describes his once satisfying life. He was well liked at school, had great friends, and received good grades, making his parents proud. The only downside was his relationship with his childhood best friend, Steve. One day, Steve persuades Darren to skip their history class. They head to the rooftop, where Steve shatters several light bulbs by hurling stones at them. He challenges Darren to do the same, but their history teacher hears the noise from above. Consequently, the boys are busted, and their parents are notified. Darren bears the brunt of the punishment, as his parents had always viewed him as a model student. They harshly reprimand him and ground him for 2 months, also demanding he sever ties with Steve, citing his negative influence. The following day, while en route to school, Darren informs Steve that his parents have instructed him to end their friendship. Distraught, Steve accuses Darren of never standing up for himself. Amid their argument, a limousine drives by and a man inside tosses out a flyer, which lands at their feet. The flyer is an invitation to a rare circus event called a freak show that supposedly occurs only once every 5 centuries. Despite their teacher's warning about the show containing illegal content, the boys choose to go. That evening, Darren and Steve sneak out of their houses and ride their bikes to the circus. Their unique interests are revealed. Darren has a fascination with spiders, while Steve is captivated by vampires. At the location, they purchase a ticket from a dwarf concealed behind a curtain. When Steve gives it the money, it bites his hand and flees. The boys disregard the odd encounter and enter the theater, discovering the event has drawn a diverse crowd, primarily adults and elderly folks. The show begins as Mr. Tall, the host, steps onto the stage, expressing gratitude to the attendees and unveiling several peculiar oddities to the audience. A wolf man emerges first, frightening everyone. Mr. Tall leads him to a woman in the crowd, and much to everyone's disbelief, he rips her hands off. As everyone watches in horror, her hands begin to recover and she walks nonchalantly onto the stage. Mr. Tall presents her as Korma Limbs, part of the freak show. Following her is Alexander Ribs, a man seemingly without ribs. Gertha Teeth, the third member, has the astonishing ability to break anything with her powerful teeth. Her companion, Rami's Two Bellies, can consume anything due to his dual bellies, even ingesting a tricycle whole and regurgitating it intact. A stunning freak, Madame Truska, invites Darren on stage to assist her, but upon touching his face, she senses something disturbing within him and backs off. The performance proceeds, and Madame Truska amazes the spectators by growing facial hair. After her act, she unexpectedly demands the show be dismantled. Despite her plea, the subsequent performer, Larten Cresply, appears with his arachnid associate, Octa, captivating the audience with a dance routine while playing an instrument. Steve identifies Larten from a vampire book and whispers to Darren that he's actually Verhostin, a vampire. Suddenly, police and townspeople, including the boys' history teacher, interrupt the show. While adults argue, Darren sneaks backstage, stealing Octa, captivated by its vibrant appearance. Forced to hide as someone enters, he's surprised to see Larten and an old man discussing the Vampanese, a hybrid vampire threat. Steve bursts in, pleading to become a vampire, as he hates his life with a missing father and alcoholic mother. After much persuasion, Larten tastes his blood but rejects Steve, sensing a malicious intention, causing Steve to flee angrily. Larten later discovers Octa's disappearance, but before he can investigate, Darren panics and flees. He is picked up by a car carrying Merlot and Mr. Tiny, who question him only to discover he is not Steve, the person they were looking for. They drop Darren home, warning they'll be in touch. The next day, Darren takes Octa to school for safety, but Steve sees them. Playing with the spider, he drops her, and she escapes. Instead of capturing her, Steve chases Octa intending to kill her, causing chaos and injuries at school. Finally, Octa bites Steve's cheek and escapes, leaving him unconscious from the venom. In the subsequent scene, Darren begs Larten at the circus to save Steve. Concerned about humans discovering their existence, Larten hesitates to help. However, he ultimately consents to supply the antidote on a single term, that Darren becomes his assistant. This necessitates abandoning his family, friends, and entire social circle. Darren must also stop attending school. Essentially, he must die. Despite the grave consequences, Darren, driven by the need to rescue his friend, accepts the terms and obtains Larten's vampire blood. They then rush to the hospital to save Steve's life. Larten promptly administers the antidote, which fortunately takes effect, and Steve begins to recuperate. The film transitions to several days later when Darren starts experiencing his body's reaction to Larten's vampire blood. He develops a craving for raw meat and is even overcome with a strong desire to kill and drink his sister's blood. Nevertheless, he resists his bloodlust and retreats to his room, where Larten is perusing his books. Larten cautions Darren that he must leave home since he poses a danger to himself and his family. Although Darren is reluctant, the close call with his sister compels him to depart. However, he doesn't want his parents to agonize over him indefinitely, so he decides to stage his death. That night, on the rooftop, Larten helps Darren in the ruse by snapping his neck, leading everyone to believe he accidentally fell to his death. The film then returns to the present, where Darren's friends, teachers, and family pay their respects at his funeral, while he is very much alive inside the coffin, amusing himself with his phone. Later that night, Larten exhumes the grave and retrieves Darren from the coffin. However, before they can escape, Merlot suddenly appears and attacks them. Luckily, Larten fends him off and temporarily subdues him. After the narrow escape, he brings Darren to the freak show encampment, where they encounter a girl named Rebecca. Simultaneously, Steve is devastated by his friend's passing, leading him to withdraw from society and spiral into madness. The pain ultimately becomes too much, and one day, he considers ending his life. However, Mr. Tiny intervenes just in time, sharing his knowledge of Steve's miserable existence and vampire fixation. He then proposes that Steve become a Vampanese like them. Tiny and Merlot are both Vampanese, a distinct race of vampires who, unlike Larten and his kind, kill humans in order to drink their blood. It is also disclosed that Vampanese and ordinary vampires are mortal enemies with incompatible views. Stunned, Steve listens as Mr. Tiny reveals the even more astonishing news that Darren is alive and thriving in another world, something Steve had always longed for. Infuriated, Steve promptly accepts the offer. In the meantime, Darren gradually adapts to life in the freak encampment, training himself and assisting others with their tasks. One day, while looking at photos from his past, Darren decides to call Steve. But before he can, Larten intervenes, confiscating the phone and destroying it. Later, Mr. Tiny visits the freak camp to discuss Darren with Larten and Mr. Tall. It seems the boy possesses unique inherent abilities, prompting Mr. Tiny to request they hand him over. Though adversaries, a tactful Mr. Tall states he will consider the proposition. Subsequently, Larten advises Darren to stay within the camp, as it is no longer safe for him outside. He then begins training Darren to ensure he can defend himself if needed. Initially, the boy struggles to even touch Larten, but as his training advances, his skills and strength grow. Meantime, Merlot transforms Steve into a Vampanese, granting him extraordinary abilities. The boy becomes increasingly wicked, and his initial target is his very own history teacher. As Darren starts to feel hungry, he craves fresh blood. To address this, Larten brings him to a nearby farm and drugs a man unconscious. He explains that vampires only borrow blood, never actually killing humans. However, despite his hunger, Darren is unable to follow through, and they return to camp. Soon after, the freak's tranquil campground is abruptly assaulted by a band of merciless Vampanese. Mayhem erupts as both sides clash in a savage battle, resulting in significant blood loss. It's evident that the Vampanese are pursuing Darren, who is discovered in a costume room with Rebecca. They attack Darren, leading to an intense skirmish. Luckily, Larten, Mr. Tall, and other freaks arrive in time to break up the fight, rescuing Darren from certain destruction. Yet, once the dust clears, it's revealed that Merlot has abducted Rebecca. The next morning, Darren sets out to locate her, feeling responsible for the entire ordeal. Simultaneously, Mr. Tiny captures Darren's family to trap him. Darren returns home to find it vacant, discovering a circus invitation on the table. At the same time, Larten prepares to join the battle, gathering weapons. Darren reaches the circus, finding Rebecca and his family bound and dangling from rope. He is stunned to see Steve among the Vampanese but attacks his former friend regardless. Larten arrives and begins battling Merlot. Weakened from not consuming blood, Darren is overpowered by Steve. Rebecca frees herself, urging Darren to drink her blood for strength. Initially reluctant, he complies after her reassurance that she'll be okay. Meanwhile, Larten suffers severe injuries but manages to stab Merlot in the heart, killing him. Darren continues fighting Steve as Mr. Tiny observes from afar. Deciding to intervene, Mr. Tiny revives Merlot, transforming him into a dwarf-like creature. He then invites both boys to join him. Shocked by his power, Steve agrees, but Darren refuses. Following the confrontation, Larten erases the recent memories of Darren's family to prevent recollection of the supernatural events. The film concludes with Darren's return to the camp, where the freaks warmly embrace him, making him feel at home. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe for more videos.